Hi, I'm standing on North Hinksey Lane outside the Fishes looking at Ruskin Cottage, and I was going to start talking about John Ruskin here, but there's a terrible noise coming from the Fishes, probably their air conditioning system, so I'm going to move a little bit down the lane until that's out of earshot. It's a shame because the cottage is better from this side with the sun as it is at the moment. And the subject of this video is John Ruskin's road building experiment, social improvement road building experiment in North Hinksey, and I'm going to explain that when I find a quiet place to do so. I said a little bit about it in the previous video, the one where I did a square circuit round Willow Lane, North Hinksey Lane, an unnamed footpath and the top of Electric Road. And as I said there, as far as I know, Ruskin never lived in Ruskin Cottage, and it was named that because this is roughly where he started the road improvements, and the cottage appears in a lot of photographs, particularly I think those by a famous photographer called Henry Taunt, photographs of the road building happening at the time. This is a lot quieter, so let me settle down by this gate. This is where I climbed over the stile in the previous video, and that's the footpath down that I took paralleling the North Hinksey Causeway and Willow Lane. So who was John Ruskin? He was a social reformer, which is most important to what I'm going to talk about now, but he was several other things as well, and those include being an artist and writer and interested in geology and interested in architecture and probably half a dozen other things too. There's a lot of fairly superficial stuff written about his attitude to life. But he was a deep thinker, and it's worth trying to go a bit deeper. I found what I think is good information from a website by James Shields, jamesshields.blogs.bucknell.edu, Bucknell, Bucknell, blog page entitled The Nature of Gothic. And Shields mentions Ruskin's most famous book, or the book that's generally regarded as his greatest book, The Stones of Venice. And that's one that explains his central moral and artistic ideas. He hated social injustice, and he hated the way that Victorian industrial capitalism promoted social injustice. Apparently, Ruskin called Victorian cities so many working models of hell. Well, I was teaching a student about 10 years ago, and he was from Hong Kong, and we had to explain some social stuff to do with the Data Protection Act and health and safety at work and so on. And as this chap wasn't English, I explained to him where our protective laws had come from. The reaction against mistreatment of factory workers back in Victorian times and so on. And he looked at some pictures of what factories were like then and shouted, "That looks just like a Chinese factory." I don't know whether he meant Chinese as opposed to Hong Kong or Chinese including Hong Kong. The attitudes would be rather different, I think. But in any case, I'll just mention, everyone knows the horrors. Workers' shifts lasting 12 to 14 hours a day, cotton dust in the air, all sorts of other dust, lung diseases, chest diseases, silicosis, all sorts of nasty things. Apparently in 1833 it was reported that up to 40% of accident cases in Manchester Infirmary were factory accidents. People had to clean machines during their lunch hours. There were no guards on pieces of machinery, which is why these accidents were so common. You had to get underneath a machine and there'd be bits oscillating away above you, and if you moved incautiously you'd probably get ripped in half. I wouldn't be surprised if, is it Time Team, have done a series on the 10 worst jobs in history or some such, because those jobs must have been pretty close to it. And that's why we now have health and safety acts. And that's part of what Ruskin was so much against and what he was thinking of. And he talked about Victorian cities being so many working models of hell. He wasn't wrong. But apart from such purely physical hazards, Ruskin was worried about industrial society being socially fragmented or psychologically fragmented into what he called a vast impersonal machine of separate self-interested atoms. And you can see the sort of thing he was worried about. The economic philosopher Adam Smith wrote about the organisation of a pin factory and how you can make the work much more efficient by allocating different bits of the pins to different workers. So one worker does the heads and another does the shafts, or whatever bits you have on pins. And that greatly speeds up the work, but it's no longer a satisfying job. It's just a piece after piece after piece after piece. That's assuming that pin making ever was a satisfying job. And there are other examples of the same sort of thing. Shields very briefly mentions Ricardo, who was a famous economic philosopher and who proposed the notion of comparative advantage, which very roughly speaking says that jobs should be allocated so that each country or each region or each trading area does the things that it can do best. And that's another kind of fragmentation. And I'm sure economic philosophers, if there are any listening to this, will think of many other examples. Those were some of the things that Ruskin was against. Of course, he was an artist as well, and he was associated with the Pre-Raphaelites, a group of artists who favoured intensely accurate drawing from close study of nature. An example, he supported the Pre-Raphaelites by writing a letter to the Times in 1851. Such letters were much more influential than they are now. And partly that was to praise an artist called Charles Alston Collins, who wanted to join the Pre-Raphaelite group. He was a Pre-Raphaelite in spirit, but not officially. Ruskin praised him for the accuracy of a picture he did of water lilies and water plantain. "I heartily wish it were mine," Ruskin wrote. And in Oxford he promoted this cause of accurate drawing by opening the School of Drawing in 1871, originally housed in what's now part of the Ashmolean. And he became its first professor, the Oxford University Slade Professor of Art. You'll have seen where the Ruskin is now, even if you don't know it. Eventually, apparently in 1975, the School of Drawing moved to its current site in the High Street, next to the examination schools, and opposite the Queen's Lane Coffee House and the bus stops. Incidentally, and something I didn't know until I checked the above, before Ruskin opened his School of Drawing, there was already an art school there, and this gradually evolved into Brookes University. So that's Ruskin's art and his social concerns, and it's the social concerns that are more concerned with the North Hinksey Road. What I'm going to do now is to walk along to the end of the current road. Remember, Ruskin Cottage is up there, and the road that Ruskin built started up there, and I moved away from it just for the noise. This is a bit of North Hinksey that people probably don't bother with very much unless they're local, because it's beyond the fishes. This is Millet Cottage, and it's named after a pre-Raphaelite artist and one who was a protégé of Ruskin. And if Ruskin ever knew that it was so named, it probably raised some bitter memories, because Ruskin married a lady called Euphemia Gray in 1848. I should have said that Ruskin's dates are 1819 to 1900. He married Euphemia Gray in 1848, and the marriage wasn't very successful apparently, and in particular it was never consummated. They didn't have marital sex, and after 6 years Euphemia fell in love with Millet and had the marriage with Ruskin annulled, and she went off with Millet. So it's a little bit insensitive perhaps to put the two cottages so close together. Right, well, for any Americans watching, this is a thatched cottage. I know you don't have them in Texas. Well, you probably do have them in Texas, actually. You probably have thatched hot dog vans in Texas. That's another thatched cottage. That's another thatched cottage. And that's another thatched cottage. The A34 is over on my right. And I mentioned the A34 partly because it's relevant to this. You can't walk directly from North Hinksey to South Hinksey. There is a route now, a dry ground route, which involves walking along the A34. It does have pavement. And the next driest route, I think, is the one that I took part of in my previous video, North Hinksey Lane, and then across the ground that I was taking, and then along Electric Road, and you can go all the way along Electric Road to South Hinksey. But the A34 wouldn't have been there in Ruskin's time, and neither would Electric Road, so you didn't even have those routes between the two villages. So remember, I'm talking about Ruskin and I'm walking south along North Hinksey Lane, and it will eventually peter out at what I think is a farm. This is a rugby ground. And one thing I discovered, and this was quite odd, I found it accidentally through Google Maps, is that there's a self-service laundrette at the far end. I can just about see it from here, and it's roughly to the right of the telegraph pole and the green sign. It's a collection of washing machines and coin or card machines and one or two other bits and pieces, and I presume it's used for cleaning dirty rugby clothing. This is where the road peters out into what I think is somebody's farm. I did once upon a time, when I was first investigating the land in this area, managed to get past the gate and walk a little bit along the track, and a farmer or somebody saw me but said nothing. But it didn't do me any good. I went halfway along a field and then discovered that the track alongside it was just disappearing and there wasn't any point in going any further. South Hinksey is in that direction, but there's no way I think that I could have got to it without sinking into the swamp. I used to try one or two alternate routes in the hope of finding a path, in the manner of these ancient traders who tried to find these fabled trading passages between different countries. East-west passages and north-south passages and so on, but there isn't one. I suspect that's an old foot and mouth notice or similar rather than a COVID notice. He's pretty certain that he doesn't want people to enter. I wonder what he's breeding. Dragons, maybe. And just for reference, this is the back of the rugby area, and that's where the washing machines are. And that literally is the end of the road as far as North Hinksey is concerned. Smash Padel. I don't know whether Padel is somebody's name or a misspelling of paddle. So North Hinksey is a funny, strung-out sort of village. That goes up to the A34. And this I probably should have pointed out on my way down, but it doesn't matter. This is the North Hinksey Village Green, and it will feature in the Ruskin story briefly. According to an Oxford Mail article from 2018, it had been out of use when the article was published for about 30 years. And people were pleased that once again children could use it as a play area. So it must have been renovated less than 10 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago maybe. Little library. I donated 2 books to it yesterday when I was sussing out the route. And the Oxford Mail article, there were actually 2 Oxford Mail articles, were also about a sapling. Somebody had donated a sapling, I think it was the Woodland Trust, to be planted here. and some villagers had disagreed with other villagers about where the saplings should be planted. Apparently they did come to a friendly conclusion. And, well, I can see people actually are playing here, because yesterday there were 2 skateboards side by side. So, why did Ruskin choose this road? It was certainly a candidate for improvement. Various descriptions that I've read of what Ruskin was interested in say that when he started his project, this road was in a terrible state. It was full of ruts and so bad that carts avoided using it in the winter and came across the village green instead, making naturally even worse ruts here. I don't know whether it was that damage that survived until the green was renovated in 2018, or whether that was for some other reason, but the road was bad anyway, and the ruts in it caused the village green to be used instead. The road was also bad because it was constantly flooding. Anybody who knows this part of Oxford won't be at all surprised. And in addition, Ruskin and various other people were beginning to appreciate the link between bad sanitation and cholera, and they were worried about cholera taking hold here. So there were purely practical reasons for wanting to improve the road. Then there was the business of getting from north to south Hinksey. Ruskin originally hoped that he'd be able to build a road right the way through the swamp and connect the 2 villages. Sorry, I think I've been bitten by another horsefly. So far, the reasons I've mentioned for Ruskin wanting to build or improve the road are practical. He wanted to benefit the villagers. He wanted to improve sanitation. He wanted to build a road between North and South Hinksey and so on. But he had other reasons to do with his ideas on the undesirability of industrial capitalism and his wish to act against the way that he thought capitalism was fragmenting society into these individual self-interested atoms. He wanted to make the students at the university more aware of the inequalities in British society and to show them what labour was really like and what it was like to work in a manual job. So let's go on to the people he employed. They were often known by locals as the Hinksey Diggers, and they were a group of students from Balliol College, 12 I think, and they included Oscar Wilde, who everybody knows as the famous poet, Arnold Toynbee, who was a well-known historian, probably most famous for trying to work out general laws about how civilizations rise and fall, and Hardwicke Rawnsley, who founded or helped found the National Trust. So I'm now going to read an account by Oscar Wilde, published in his book Essays and Lectures. Ruskin first proposed his idea to Wilde and the other students in March 1874, and this is Wilde telling what happened then and later. So he went out round Oxford and found two villages, Upper and Lower Hinksey. That's what the two Hinkseys were called then, apparently. And between them there lay a great swamp, so that the villagers could not pass from one to the other without many miles of a round. And when we came back in winter, he asked us to help him make a road across the morass for these village people to use. So out we went, day after day, and learned how to lay levels and how to break stones, and to wheel barrows along a plank, a very difficult thing to do. And Ruskin worked with us in the mist and rain and mud of an Oxford winter, and our friends and our enemies came out and mocked us from the bank. We did not mind it much then, and we did not mind it afterwards at all, but worked away for 2 months at our road. And what became of the road? Well, like a bad lecture, it ended abruptly, in the middle of the swamp. Ruskin going away to Venice. When we came back for the next term, there was no leader, and the diggers, as they called us, fell asunder. So that's Oscar Wilde, and so Ruskin never finished his road, and it ended abruptly in the middle of the swamp, probably where that farm is now. And it's worth saying, I mentioned that Ruskin's greatest work is called The Stones of Venice, and I presume that's what he was going away to Venice that Wilde mentioned to work on. The humorous magazine Punch published a satirical poem. Scholars of Ruskin, to him be true, the truth he has writ in the stones of Venice may be taught by the stones of Hinksey too. So that's Ruskin, The Stones of Venice and The Stones of Hinksey. See you next time.